In the summer of 1198 BC, a girl named Merit stood barefoot on cold limestone as a bronze blade scraped across her scalp, removing every trace of the black hair her mother had braided that morning. She was 8 years old. She didn't know that she would never see her mother again. She didn't know that the name Merit would be forbidden by sunset, replaced with a title that marked her as property. She didn't know that 43 years later she would die in this same temple complex, her body buried in an unmarked pit, her existence erased from every record as if she had never lived at all. But here's what you need to understand before we go any further. Manette wasn't unusual. She wasn't a tragic exception to an otherwise noble system. She was one of thousands, and what happened to her, what was done to her, under the banner of religious devotion, what the priests justified with sacred language and divine authority, represents one of the most systematic exploitations in ancient history. If you think you know about ancient Egypt, if you've seen the temples and admired the hieroglyphs and imagined a civilization of wisdom and spiritual enlightenment, then I need you to prepare yourself, because what I am about to reveal, documented in temple inscriptions that archaeologists have found hidden in storage rooms, recorded in administrative papyri that survived by accident, whispered in the accounts of Greek and Roman visitors who witnessed these practices, will fundamentally change how you see those beautiful monuments. Subscribe right now if you want to understand how religious authority can weaponize sacred language to disguise systematic abuse. Hit that subscribe button, because this isn't mythology or speculation. This is documented history that mainstream narratives prefer to ignore. Let me start by explaining what these girls actually were, because the terminology itself was designed to hide the truth. The Egyptian terms most commonly found in temple records are Hemet Necher, literally servant of the god, or sometimes Henet Necher, which translates as songstress of the god. Beautiful titles that sound honorable and chosen, but here's what those titles actually meant in practice. These weren't priestesses in the sense of spiritual leaders or religious authorities. They weren't women who had chosen sacred service as a calling. They were girls, often between the ages of 7 and 10, who had been given or sold to temples by their families, or who had been taken as tribute from conquered territories, or who had been designated for temple service to settle debts. Once assigned to a temple, they became legal property of that institution, bound to serve until death, with no rights to leave, no authority over their own bodies, and no voice in decisions about their lives. The Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BC, wrote something that most translations downplay or mistranslate. He described girls who were dedicated to temples, and he used a specific word, hierodoloi, which doesn't just mean temple servant. It specifically means sacred slave. He understood what he was seeing, even if the priests who showed him around used more elegant language. Now let me tell you how girls entered this system, because understanding the mechanisms of recruitment reveals the calculated nature of this exploitation. There were 3 primary pathways, and none of them involved genuine choice. First, family dedication. In times of crisis, drought, famine, or when a family desperately needed divine favor, parents could pledge a daughter to temple service. This was framed as an act of piety, as giving your child to the gods as the ultimate sacrifice. Temple priests encouraged this practice, promising that the family would receive blessings, that the girl would live a life of spiritual fulfillment, that it was the highest honor a family could bestow. But here is the reality. Most families who gave daughters to temples were either desperately poor or deeply in debt to those same temples. The dedication wasn't a voluntary offering. It was economic transaction disguised as religious devotion. Once the dedication ceremony was complete, the family lost all legal connection to the girl. She belonged to the temple, and attempting to reclaim her would be considered sacrilege. Second, Debt settlement. Temples were major economic powers in ancient Egypt, owning vast agricultural lands, controlling trade routes, lending grain and silver at interest. When families couldn't repay their debts, temples had the legal right to take property. And in Egyptian law, children were property. Administrative papyri from temples at Karnak and elsewhere contain lists of girls received as debt compensation, with ages and descriptions noted as casually as inventory of livestock. Third, conquest tribute. When Egyptian armies conquered territories in Nubia or the Levant, the spoils of war included human beings. Young girls were specifically selected for temple service, transported hundreds of miles from their homes, unable to speak Egyptian, completely severed from their families and cultures. Temple records proudly document these acquisitions, describing girls from foreign lands as gifts from Pharaoh to the gods. Let me tell you about a girl named Takait. She was 9 years old when her father, a merchant in Memphis who had borrowed heavily from the Temple of Ptah to finance a trade expedition, lost 3 cargo ships in a storm. The debt was enormous. The temple demanded payment. Takayet's father owned a modest house and some warehouse space, but it wasn't enough to cover what he owed. The temple priests offered a solution. Dedicate your daughter to temple service, and we'll consider the debt satisfied. Takayet's father tried to negotiate, offering to work for the temple, to give up his business, anything but his child. The priests were patient but firm. The temple needs servants, they explained. Your daughter will be honored, blessed by the gods, living a life of sacred purpose. Refuse, and we'll seize everything you own, leaving your entire family destitute. Choose. Takayet's father made the choice that hundreds of fathers made. He told his daughter she was receiving a great honor. He led her to the temple himself. He participated in the dedication ceremony, speaking the words that transferred ownership of his child to the religious institution. And then he walked away, leaving Takayet standing alone in a courtyard surrounded by priests and women she didn't know, while her mother wept at home, forbidden from attending the ceremony. Now pay close attention, because what happened next to girls like Takayet and Menat reveals the systematic psychological breaking that transformed children into compliant servants. The dedication rituals weren't brief ceremonies. They were extended processes designed to strip away identity and reconstruct the girl as temple property. The first ritual was purification through water. The girl would be taken to a sacred pool within the temple complex, usually enclosed and private. Senior temple women would strip away the clothing the girl had worn from home, removing every physical connection to her former life. Then, priests would enter. Here is where it becomes disturbing. These purification baths involved intimate inspection of the girl's body, conducted by male priests who claimed they were checking for physical purity and ensuring the girl was suitable for sacred service. 8-year-old girls would be touched and examined by strange men while being told this was holy, that the gods required this inspection, that resistance would bring divine punishment on their families. Takayet tried to pull away when the priest's hands began moving over her body. She was grabbed roughly by a senior temple woman who hissed in her ear, "The gods are watching. If you shame yourself, you shame your family. Your father will lose everything. Stay still." Takayet froze, terrified, confused while the examination continued. She learned in that moment that her body was no longer hers, that men with religious authority could access it whenever they claimed sacred necessity. After the purification bath came the shaving ritual. The girl's head would be completely shaved, removing every trace of her hair. This served multiple purposes. It marked her as different from ordinary people. It removed a key element of her personal identity, and it stripped away any vanity or connection to physical appearance. When Menat saw her reflection in a bronze mirror after her head was shaved, she didn't recognize the bald child staring back. That stranger wasn't Menat. That stranger was what the temple had created. Then came the renaming. The girl's birth name would be taken away and replaced with a name chosen by temple authorities. These new names were often generic, marking function rather than identity. She who sings for Hathor, belonging to Mut, beautiful for Amun. Takayat became Nefertijet, meaning beautiful offering. Her birth name was forbidden. If caught speaking it, she would be punished. The symbolic death of the former self was made complete through what temple records call the divine marriage ceremony. Girls designated for certain types of temple service would undergo a ritual where they were symbolically married to the god they would serve. This ceremony involved dressing the girl in fine linen, adorning her with jewelry, and presenting her before the goddess statue or shrine, while priests spoke on behalf of the deity, claiming to accept the bride. Let me describe what happened to Menat during her divine marriage to the god Amun. She was dressed more elaborately than ever before in her short life. Her bald head was covered with an elaborate wig. She was led into the inner sanctuary, a massive stone chamber lit by oil lamps, dominated by the towering statue of Amun with its unblinking eyes of semi-precious stones. The high priest stood before the statue. Other priests formed a circle around Menat. The high priest began chanting in archaic Egyptian that Menat barely understood. He claimed to be speaking for the god, speaking as the god. He declared that Amun had chosen Menat, that she would become his eternal bride, that her body was now a temple housing divine presence. Then Menat was told to repeat vows. I give myself to Amun. My body is his temple. My life is his property. I will serve in purity and obedience forever. Menat repeated the words. She had no choice. She didn't fully understand what she was promising, but the priests recorded her vows as legally binding. From that moment, Menat could never marry a human man, could never own property, could never lead temple service. She belonged to the god, which in practice meant she belonged to the priests who claimed to represent him. Now let me tell you what daily life looked like for these temple girls, because the reality was designed to prevent any possibility of resistance or escape. The day began before dawn in communal sleeping quarters, where junior temple women lived crowded together under constant supervision. Privacy didn't exist. The women slept on simple reed mats with no personal possessions. Anything from their former lives had been confiscated during dedication. After waking, the women underwent morning purification, washing with natron water and putting on simple white linen that marked their status. Then they proceeded to assign duties, weaving linen for hours, preparing food offerings, grinding grain, brewing beer, maintaining gardens. All this labor benefited the temple economically, but it was framed as sacred service. Some women had more specifically religious duties. The Shimayite, the singers and musicians, would practice hymns and learn instruments like the sistrum or hand drums. These women would perform during ceremonies, providing music believed to please the gods. But here is the key. Throughout all activities, silence was enforced except when speech was specifically permitted. Temple women were expected to work quietly, to move through spaces without drawing attention, to speak only when addressed by superiors. Unnecessary conversation was punished. The silence served multiple purposes. It prevented women from forming bonds that might lead to resistance. It maintained an atmosphere of obedience, and it kept them isolated even when surrounded by others. Take tried to make friends with another girl who worked beside her at the looms. They would whisper occasionally when overseers weren't watching. Brief sentences spoken so quietly they were almost inaudible. I dreamed about my mother. Do you remember what dates tasted like? How many years until we die? One day an overseer caught them whispering. She struck Takate across the back of the head with a wooden rod. Takate fell forward, blood running from her scalp. The overseer announced loudly to all the women, "This is what happens to those who break silence. This is what happens to those who forget they have no voice." Takahate was dragged away. When she returned 3 days later, something had broken inside her. She wouldn't speak at all anymore, not even whispers. Her eyes were dead. She worked mechanically but never looked at anyone, never responded when others tried to speak to her during rest periods. 2 months later, Take disappeared. The overseer announced she had been found impure and returned to the gods. No one was told what that meant, but everyone understood the message. This is what happens when you resist. But the surveillance and control went even deeper. These women were subject to regular purity inspections conducted by priests. These inspections involved intimate examinations of the women's bodies, supposedly to verify they remained pure and hadn't been corrupted by impure thoughts or actions. In reality, these inspections were systematic violations disguised as religious necessity. Menat underwent these inspections monthly. She would be summoned to a small room where a priest waited. She would remove her clothing and stand while he examined her, his hands moving over her body while he muttered prayers about checking for signs of impurity. Menat learned to detach her mind from her body during these examinations, to let her consciousness go somewhere else, while her physical form was handled and invaded. Now, I need to tell you about the ritual duties that certain temple women were required to perform. The duties that official inscriptions describe in beautiful poetic language that masks what actually happened. This is where the exploitation becomes most systematic and most disturbing. Certain women, particularly those designated as goddess wives or serving deities associated with fertility like Hathor or Min, had roles in what temple records call sacred union rituals or divine marriage rites. These ceremonies were supposedly reenactments of mythological events, rituals where divine powers were invoked to ensure cosmic order and fertility. The language used to describe these rituals is elaborate and metaphorical. The god enters his temple, divine seed is planted. The goddess receives her consort. Beautiful poetry that can be interpreted various ways. But let me tell you what these rituals actually involved. High-ranking priests, particularly the high priest, claimed to embody the god during certain ceremonies. They would dress in costumes representing the deity, speak in ritual language claiming to be the god's voice, and perform acts that were described as the god acting through them, but that involved very human bodies. Women designated for sacred union would be prepared through purification rituals, dressed ceremonially, brought to inner sanctuaries where outsiders were forbidden, and told they were about to receive the god's blessing. That divine power would flow through them. That resistance would anger the god and bring catastrophe to all of Egypt. Then priests claiming to act as vessels for divine power would exercise what they called divine marriage rites. Let me be absolutely clear. These were not consensual relationships between equals. These were coerced encounters between powerful men who controlled every aspect of these women's lives, and powerless women who had been conditioned from childhood to believe their bodies belonged to the gods, and that priests spoke with divine authority. When Menat was 14, she was selected for her first sacred union ritual. She was told this was a great honor, that she would participate in the festival of divine marriage, that Amun himself would bless her. She was given better food than usual, bathed more carefully, dressed in finer garments than she had ever worn. Other temple women looked at her with expressions of pity and fear. On the ritual night, Menat was brought to the inner sanctuary. The space was filled with incense smoke and lamplight. The high priest wore an elaborate costume and mask, transforming him into a representation of the god. Other priests chanted in a circle around the sanctuary. The high priest approached Minat and told her she was about to receive the god's blessing, that Amun would enter her, that she must submit completely. When Minat began to understand what was about to happen, she tried to back away. Other priests grabbed her arms. The high priest told her she could not refuse the god, that resistance was blasphemy, that failure in this duty would curse her family and all Egypt. What happened next in that sanctuary, surrounded by chanting priests and choking incense, was recorded in temple documents as successful completion of religious ritual. But Menat knew, even at 14, that what had been done to her wasn't sacred. It was violation disguised as religion, exploitation disguised as ritual. And there was nothing she could do, no one she could tell, no justice she could seek, because the men who violated her were the same men who defined what justice meant. Some women underwent these sacred unions repeatedly, selected again and again for rituals requiring female participants. The frequency depended on temple calendars and which ceremonies required this type of ritual. Major festivals might involve multiple such rituals. And here is something that makes this even more disturbing. Some women bore children from these sacred unions. The children were considered blessed, marked by a divine favor, destined for temple service. But they were also evidence of what had happened to their mothers. When Menat was 16, she realized she was pregnant. She had been selected for sacred union rituals several more times since the first. She didn't know which priest was the father. The pregnancy terrified her. When it became visible, Menat was moved to quarters where pregnant temple women lived. There were other women there, all in various stages of pregnancy, all victims of the same system. One older woman told Menat what to expect. The child will be taken after weaning. If a girl, she becomes a temple servant like us. If a boy, he's raised by priests. You will see the child sometimes, but the child won't truly be yours. The child belongs to the temple, just as you belong to the temple. Menat gave birth to a daughter. She named her Hetep in her heart, though temple records gave the child a different name. For 3 years, Menat was allowed to nurse and care for her daughter. Then the child was taken away to begin training as a temple servant. Menat was returned to regular duties. She would occasionally see her daughter passing in corridors, but was forbidden from acknowledging their relationship. Menat watched her daughter grow up from a distance, watched her being broken and trained exactly as she herself had been broken and trained. And she could do nothing to protect her, save her, or even comfort her. This was the cruelest thing. Not just being exploited herself, but watching her daughter absorbed into the same system, knowing the cycle would continue. Now let me tell you what happened to women who tried to resist. The punishments were designed to terrify not just the individual, but every witness. Some temples practiced what they called purification through correction, extended fasting, extended isolation in dark storage rooms, physical beatings administered while priests watched. But the worst punishment was reserved for women who tried to escape, or who spoke openly against the system. Dedication to the desert. The woman would be taken outside the temple grounds into the desert regions beyond cultivated land, into territory Egyptians associated with chaos and death. Then she would be abandoned with no water, food, or shelter. A woman named Iset stood up during a meal and spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "This is not holy. These men are not gods. We are prisoners. We should resist." Within minutes, guards seized her and dragged her before the high priest. Without speaking, he gestured, and guards began pulling Iset toward the temple gates. The temple women were forced to watch as Iset was marched into the desert. They stood at the walls and watched her become a small figure in the vastness. Guards simply walked away from her and returned to the temple, The women were forced to watch for hours as Iset tried to walk back, but arrows were shot near her feet to drive her back. They watched her collapse in heat, stand again, wander in circles. By nightfall, Iset had stopped moving. The next day, women were marched out to see Iset's body. The temple wanted them to see exactly what happened to resistors. The high priest spoke. "This is what happens to the impure. This is what the gods do to blasphemers. Let her body lie unburied. Let her spirit wander forever without rest." But here is what priests didn't anticipate. The memory of Iset became a different kind of lesson. Some women, instead of being cowed into submission, began to see clearly. This system wasn't sacred. It was exploitation. The priests weren't to divine. They were men using religion to justify cruelty. Resistance had to be subtle, invisible. Women would exchange glances that said, "We know this is a lie." They would make deliberate mistakes in weaving that spelled out words. "I am here. I remember. I resist." And in some cases, women found ways to leave testimony. In hidden corners of temple complexes, in places supervisors rarely checked, some women carved brief messages into stone. Tiny inscriptions, quickly scratched, easy to miss. But they were there. "I was born free. They took that from me. My name was Nebet before they changed it. That name is dead, but I wanted to write it once. I bore 3 children. All were taken. I love them though I was not allowed to. To whoever finds this, we suffered. We did not choose this. We were not blessed. We were prisoners. Tell our story if you can." These messages, carved fearfully in stolen moments, were desperate attempts to be remembered, to leave some trace of individual existence. The women knew these messages might never be found, might not be understood or believed, but they carved them anyway, because the alternative, total erasure, was unbearable. When temple women died, they were buried in ways reflecting their status as property. No family tombs, no monuments, often just mass graves or unmarked burials. When Menat died at 52, having spent 44 years in temple service, her body was placed in a communal pit with 3 other temple women. No coffin, just linen wrappings. No ceremony, just a brief prayer. No marker, nothing to indicate she had ever existed. Her daughter, now an adult who had spent her entire life in the temple, wasn't allowed to mourn openly or visit the burial site. Within days, other temple women were instructed not to speak of Menat, to act as if she had never existed. This erasure was systematic and purposeful. Temple authorities wanted these women forgotten as individuals, but some resisted this erasure. In a dark storage room corner where she had been sent to count jars, an elderly woman who had been captured from Nubia as a child carved her final message days before dying of fever. "I came from beyond the first cataract. My mother's name was Amaneh." She sang songs in the Nubian language. I remember her voice, though I haven't heard it in 40 years. I never forgot her. This life was not my choice. These gods were not my gods. If anyone finds this, know that I existed. Know that I remembered. Know that I never stopped being myself, even when they called me by Egyptian names and told me I belonged to their goddess. She died 2 days later. Her message remained on the wall, hidden in darkness, unknown to priests who buried her in an unmarked grave, unknown to her daughter taken at age 3, unknown to thousands who walked past that storage room over following centuries. But the message was there. Her defiance, carved in stone, lasting longer than the temple that tried to erase her. A whisper from darkness saying, "I existed. I mattered. Remember me." This is what temples of Egypt tried to hide. This is what beautiful hieroglyphs Dante tell you. This is the reality behind sacred language and divine imagery. Thousands of women taken as children, exploited for decades, erased in death, leaving only whispers and fragments and tiny rebellions carved secretly into stone. The temples still stand. Tourists still visit, admiring massive columns and beautiful reliefs, photographing statues and painted walls. Guides tell stories about pharaohs and gods and glory of Egyptian religion. But almost no one mentions the temple women. Almost no one tells the story of girls who were taken, rituals that broke them, exploitation that defined their lives, erasure that followed their deaths. But now you know. Now you understand what happened behind those beautiful walls. Now you can see temples differently. Recognize that human suffering is carved into stones alongside hieroglyphs. Now you can remember women who spent their lives in those spaces, who tried to resist in the only ways available, who left messages hoping someone would find them and understand and remember. They were Menet, 8 years old when taken. They were Takate, 9 when her father traded her for debt forgiveness. They were Iset and thousands of others whose names we'll never know because records were deliberately destroyed or never kept. They were people. They suffered. They existed. And they deserve to be remembered not as servants of gods, not as components of temple machinery, but as human beings who endured unimaginable exploitation and who nevertheless found ways to resist, to remember, to leave testimony that might someday reach someone who would listen. What do you think about this history? How should we approach ancient monuments that were sites of systematic abuse? Leave your comments below. If you believe this kind of history needs to be told, that uncomfortable truths are more important than comfortable myths, then subscribe. We investigate darkest aspects of ancient history with attention to evidence and sources. We give voice to experiences that official records tried to hide. Hit that subscribe button and share this video with anyone who needs to understand that not everything